No, really. Okay, I'm hit. Okay, record has been hit. Yay, we're recording. All right, folks, we are down to the second to last episode of Mentioned in Dispatches Season 16. We have another guest from England with us, so we can say it is the penultimate episode because folks in England actually know what that means. People here in the U.S. tend to misuse that word pretty horrifically. We have leaned a little heavier into the professional space this season, but that was by design. That was one of the things we intended to do this season, and this is another one of those. But we've got one more episode next week. We will be doing our convention look ahead to all the events coming up this summer. We got a couple of different guests going to be joining us that will be parts of those convention plans throughout the summer, and so we'll have a chat with those guys, and then we'll wrap up the podcast until the fall because we've got convention stuff we got to deal with this summer, and there's no way we can maintain podcast velocity and get convention things done. It's just not realistic. But for tonight, this is a single guest episode, but that's because she's got plenty to tell us all about. We have Aggie Hirst is here from still King's College, London, right? I did miss that.
Correct. Yep. Still for my sins at King's, very happily.
Yes, and one of the coolest cities in the world. It's one of those ones that, like, I'm not a big city kind of person, but there's like 3 big cities in the world I'd be more than happy to go live in, and London is one of them. But the other thing that I learned moving around my dad growing up in the military a bunch is whenever you move somewhere new, you got to be there for at least 2 years to really get everything out of being there. It takes at least 2 years because what inevitably happens is you'll show up at work or at school or wherever on Monday morning and somebody go, oh, hey, did you go do X, Y, or Z this week? And you're like, no, I didn't even know what was happening. Oh, it happens this weekend every year. And so now you'll put it on the calendar to make sure you do it the next year. Otherwise,
trouble with London is it's kind of like 15, 20 cities rolled into one, right? It's kind of a host of big towns, and you end up just kind of plonked into one of those, and sometimes there's just no integration between them. So you have to spend, I guess, maybe a couple of years per one of those to get a feel for what's really happening.
Yeah, and my familiarity with London is primarily as a tourist, so it's like all of the tourist traps downtown. Whose primary goal is to separate me from my money. Right. Like, I get that, but you go into it with your eyes wide open. Like, that's exactly what you signed up for. If you're in that part of London down there near all of the tourist sites, that's what you're doing. It is what it is. So there's plenty that Aggie has done in terms of some of the different wargaming pieces, but the primary thing we're here to talk about is the book that she wrote that was released, I think it was early last year, wasn't it?
2024 initially.
Okay, so, man, I'm losing track of the years. It's called Politics of Play, and it is about the use of wargaming primarily in the American military. But I think, if I recall correctly, you do address some non-military wargaming in there as well. Like, there's places where you talk about some of the intel folks, and it's national security, but it's not straight military folks as well.
Right. Yeah. I wanted to try and get quite a broad understanding of how wargaming is being used across the defense establishment and kind of commensurate areas in the States. So my previous research had looked at the United States, and I built on that for this project, really as an outsider to the gaming world. And it was absolutely fascinating to work alongside folks in and around defense who are professionals in this sphere. Taught me a huge amount, without which the project would never have been anything close to as complete as it became.
Yeah. And I think this may sound a little weird to the gaming audience that normally listens to us, but I think the fact that you were coming from outside the primary gaming world allowed you to take a very fresh look at a lot of those assumptions and connections and ideas that people bring to the table, that you were able to step back and have a more clear-eyed view of what folks were saying, what they're doing, how they're doing it, the viewpoints that people take. You didn't have the baked-in assumptions that come with a lot of those.
Yeah, I hope so. You never know coming into something from the outside whether that sort of different vantage point is going to be useful to people, or if it's going to end up, putting people's backs up, or people are going to ask, who is this kind of newbie? What's she doing here? But I found the welcome to be really remarkable. People were super open, really keen to talk. I think, as Peter Perler has sort of said for many years, we are in this kind of crest of a wave of a sine wave of wargaming's popularity. And I think with some of that renewed attention, from from the higher ups in DoD, people really, I think, found it to be a great time to be talking about wargaming and all of the progress, all the accomplishments, all the changes that were going on from those memos that came out 2014, 2015 from DoD.
Well, some of those memos were out in 2015 and 16 as well. I mean, those have been around for a while, because I can remember pre-COVID folks talking about some of those ideas and what, again, it's a cyclical thing. The reinvigoration of wargaming in the DoD, and then 5 years later, it's the reinvigoration, and then 5 years after that, it's the reinvigoration of wargaming at the DoD. And
I mean, this is when the project really began. I started coming along to actually some of the connections conventions at King's College. In fact, before I worked there, in around 2016, something like that, I began doing interviews with the community of practice 2017-18. As you know, academic publishing moves at a glacial pace, so it took a little while to get things done. Of course, COVID, threw a number of spanners in the works, but I was super fortunate to have done a bunch of field work, having got a bunch of funding pre-COVID, and so I could actually use the kind of time where we were all kind of benched during COVID to write up a bunch of that. So I had like 100 hours of interviews that I'd accrued, had some fantastic research assistants who helped me process all of that data. And so I was really able to just kind of plug into that and try to extract as much value as I could from that, which is why the book is so quotation heavy. I was really interested to have the community speak for itself, especially as an outsider coming in, right? It's not necessarily so fascinating what I have to say about these things. I think one of the value added of the book, which some of the early reviewers, Ed McGrady and Peter Perler mentioned, was that it actually serves to capture something of what the community was up to in the kind of 10-year period from those initial memos and the initial push for the resurgence of wargaming.
For the audience that may not know as much about the book, let's back up slightly, and I want to give you the opportunity to kind of cover two things, but I'm going to ask you to sort of take the academic hat off a little bit, because while our audience is reasonably well educated, they are not academics, and that is a warning that I put out on the previous podcast about the Wargamers bookshelf, that this is a book written as an academic, primarily seems for an academic audience, and if that's not a style of writing that you're used to, it can take some time to adjust. Now, I have an academic background. I've been out of practice for a little while, but it did take me a little bit of time to adjust to it, but I got back into it fairly quickly. For folks that haven't read academic writing, there's an adjustment period you're gonna have to deal with. So for those folks, for the sake of that segment of our audience, what was the nugget at the center of all of this that you were trying to get at, and kind of how did you come up with, hey, that's something I'm really interested in?
Thanks. Well, it's a great question. It's one of those questions of like the origin story of any project, right? So this for me was like the difficult second album. I'd had my first book, I'd done my PhD, it was on the invasion of Iraq, the neoconservatives, so still looking at the United States. But I'd always had this question of games as a kind of topic of research in the back of my head. I grew up around gaming a lot. I'm a horrible gamer myself, so I would just put that out there as well. But games played such a crucial part in the kind of development and social sort of worlds of my peer group. And I've always been fascinated to ask the question of kind of how does play capture us so fully? How does immersion work? What is it? Where do we go when we play? And what I started looking at when I was thinking about this as a research project was in my own field, in international politics, there's already a bunch been written on things like video games, recreational games. But looking at some of the things that had happened post 9/11 in the gaming world, I started to realize that in academic circles, not much had been written about the games that are actually played in and around defense. And so I started thinking, right, what if I try to sketch a project that looks like this? Surely I'm missing something. But it actually turned out to be that there wasn't a great deal of literature. So I thought, okay, here's something I can contribute to. So as I say, the next move was to actually try to get out of the office, get out of the dusty library where we as academics sit, and get out in the field. My first book had been very much a kind of, sit there gathering dust behind closed doors. And it was so exciting and such a breath of fresh air to get out into the practical world, the gamer world, and to see, what is it that people are seeking to do with games? What are they used for in the military? How successful are they in their objectives? How do they factor in the life cycle of warfighters, right from kind of recruitment and early days, right through kind of the training, through education, through deployment, and as I found to my surprise, also out the other side through to rehabilitation. Yeah. And I just found it captivating that we treat games as so unserious, right? Both in the academic world, but also in the kind of social world, right? You know, we play on our downtime. We play when we're not at work, at least for most people. But what I started to realize was how serious these things are. People play seriously and they have very serious real world effects as teaching tools, as tools of education, as tools of kind of mental health support, and a whole bunch of other things besides around experimentation, analysis, and research as well. So I think I've been really sort of humbled by and surprised by how many applications there were out there to be researched. And of course, this continues to proliferate with things like the rise of AI and all kinds of new applications.
Yeah, indirectly, you are describing one of the things that we've run into in the professional wargaming space for a number of years, and that is a war game is an artifact, but the purpose to which you can use it is many varied. Right. And what you're doing with it will frequently determine how it's structured, you know, who's involved, what are the outcome goals that you're after, what are the inputs you're after, and whether it's an analytical tool or a training tool or a rehearsal tool or an exploratory tool or a team building exercise. Like there's all kinds of different uses, and we've had sessions from Connections Online about this in the past, and I'm sure there's been some at Connections US and UK as well, that using the term, hey, we need to hold a war game on X, Y, or Z. Well, that's fine, but what are the actual purposes for which we are doing this? Because if I say war game and you say war game and we're not thinking of the same kind of thing, one of us is thinking training, another one's thinking an analytical tool, we're not going to converge on what we're after, without a whole lot of yelling at each other, it seems like.
Absolutely. Well, two things spring to mind as you're speaking. The first is that one of the things I try and do in the book, without collapsing the difference between these types of games, is also to think about also what they have in common. And one thing that occurred to me on fieldwork in interviews is that actually, and I like the way Raf Costa puts this, that all games are what he calls edutainment, right? And I think what's really powerful about that is that even games used for analysis or research, they still teach stuff. And I was really captivated and really focused on in the project to try to figure out, like, how does that learning take place? How do we learn through games? Is it to do with this kind of state of immersion that we go into? Does stuff kind of get into the brain and stay there more effectively if you learn under conditions of immersion? But what are the kind of effects of that? What are the ethical questions around that? I was super interested to get into as well. I actually begin the book, just to go back to that second point, trying to wade through the kind of conceptual quagmire that exists around like that big question, like what is a war game? Because I did about 100 hours plus of interviews, and I don't think any two war game professionals describe war games the same way. And that's before we get into games around, being processual or being process oriented, around, being deterministic, open-ended, being rigid, or, all the rest.
I dare say a few of them probably gave you more than one definition.
Certainly. Sometimes we didn't get past the definition part in the whole hour-long interview. And that's before you even get to questions of, what's the relationship between a war game and a simulation, or a war game and an exercise. So I actually dedicate a significant chunk of chapter 1 of the book actually trying to wade through that, less to come down on like yet another fixed definition, and more just to give like a roadmap or an overview of like what are the points of contention and overlap between these different definitions, and how do we just navigate that so that we can at least have a sense of what we mean when we're talking about a war game. It's not out in the field. It does have two or more competing human players and so on. But not easy to land on consensus there at all.
Now, one of the ways in which I've had some limited success tackling that issue, just in my own experience, is when necessary. Again, the key is when necessary. We're not going to do this just to pick a fight, but for the purpose of this exercise, of this presentation, of this discussion, we are going to define war game as blah, whatever that is, right? Any other time and place you choose to define it as something else, that's cool. I don't care. But for the purpose of today, for the next 2 hours, whenever we say war game, we mean this thing, whatever that thing is. And you know, if you disagree with it, that's cool. For the next 2 hours, pretend you don't, you know, and let's try
to get ahead of it. That's right.
So that seems to have worked the couple of times I've needed to do it. Fortunately, I haven't had to do it very often, so that's cool. But there are times where the definition matters, especially when you're dealing with military folks that literally have books full of very exact definitions. Like we have books on doctrinal terms for a reason, you know, because they mean very specific things, and so you got to be particular about it. So you were a little nutty in wanting to go talk to this particular crew of people. I thought maybe you just lost a bet and like.
Do you know what? If there'd been a bet, I would certainly see myself as having won it. I still, you know, in academic spaces, you know, there's a lot of different ways of doing research, and interviews oftentimes come into it. Field research comes into it. You know, going off on location. But especially when it comes to defense establishments, it's not super easy to get access, and it's not. You know, I could not have expected how well the kind of snowballing process would have gone for the interviews. And in some measure, that was really thanks to some of the kind of real goods and the greats of the field. You know, Peter Perler himself, you know, dearly departed, of course, now, and a bunch of other very sort of, you know, senior ranking folks in the community really assisted me very greatly by, you know, writing collective emails, forwarding my research program to folks they thought would be interested. And, you know, I would say that somewhere in the region of around 90% of people, maybe 85, you know, responded positively. Some didn't get back, and you expect that, but normally you'd expect a much lower ratio than that. And so I was, really surprised and grateful that people were so keen to talk and has so much to say, and really formed the bedrock of the project in that regard.
People listening can't see us on camera looking at each other, but I do have a copy of the book. I kind of waved it at you a little earlier. Hard to get you to autograph it by long distance, but one of these days I'll get it signed at some point. I'll go there, you'll come here or something. But so going through, you know, obviously recognizing a bunch of the names in the book because wargaming is not that big community. But it did strike me that it seemed like a lot of the folks that were significantly heavily quoted throughout the book are not people that were in uniform. Now they're folks that have been around professional wargaming for a very long time. Like anybody that knows Ed McGrady knows that he's been doing this for a while. And, right. and a lot of these folks have been doing, you know, their resumes go back to 1980 something with wargaming as, you know, as part of the top line in that entry. But there weren't a lot of folks in uniform. Was that because you had trouble getting them? Was that because we just move people in uniform around too damn much? Was that because they weren't allowed to talk to you? Was that how did that not materialize, I guess?
So for the most part, so you'll notice in the book that sort of roughly about 50-50 of the quotes are attributed, and then the other 50 not. And most of the folks I spoke to in uniform just preferred not to be referred to by name. Okay. I would say probably, as you say, more I guess, again, this is a good couple of years ago, I'd say probably, 65-70% of people weren't currently in uniform, but there was a good chunk of folks that I did speak to who were. The other side of it was, I also, and this is where Scott Morland was just so helpful to me. He invited me off to a couple of CPXs. So I was able to do kind of, fieldwork research, which was less about kind of interviews or less about attributable interviews and more about kind of participant observation. And so a lot of that sense of what the serving military folks were doing was done through that sort of alternate research method. It was interesting to me, though, that who did or who did not feel like they wanted to have their name appear. Of course, when you're doing interviews with people, there's a leap of faith there, a kind of leap of trust there. And just perhaps those folks who were, not currently serving just felt they had perhaps slightly fewer reservations about it.
Yeah. And not going to try to get you to name them now on the podcast, because that's still not cool. You mentioned Scott, one of those small world stories that will probably annoy a couple of our listeners, but I actually knew Scott back in the 90s. Scott and I were a part of a unit in California together at the same time. He was the personnel officer while I was the intel officer. We were both lowly lieutenants out in Monterey, California. Back in the late 90s. Mm-hmm. So when you did the book launch and Scott shows up as one of the people there as a part of, wait a minute, I know that guy. I talked to him in 20 years, but I know that guy. So, because he'd worked at Naval Postgraduate School there in Monterey for a while, and I don't know if he's still there, but he at one point he was working there. He had left, and I think he came back, and I'm not sure if he'd left again. But yeah, in the late '90s when I lived out in Monterey, Scott and I were in it for a while, which was kind of weird to see him pop up again later.
It, honestly, I can't exaggerate the extent to which he helped me out. Not only did he do 2 fantastic interviews and invite me to 2 CPXs, one bilateral US and India, and one kind of more international out in Sweden. But even like the logistics of being on base with him, like, being just kind of taken around and introduced to folks, and being like allowed to be a free range researcher, right? Just kind of pecking into whatever I found interesting on site. And these were due to the authorizations that he arranged for me. So, I think he's my first acknowledgement in the book. I really owe a huge debt of gratitude to him. And great that you guys have that background.
Yeah. No, that's great. It was just one of those weird, somebody from the past popping up again, going, wait a minute, I know that guy. So as you obviously went in with a certain thesis that you were interested in exploring. As the interviews came along, and as you were discussing, as you got deeper into the interviews, the people you were talking with, and some of those observations you were talking about, how close to the original thesis did you come out the other side, versus how much of it did it kind of shift or be shaped a little more by what you had observed? When and where and how did that kind of shift, or was it something that you were able to stay on a pretty straight path through the process?
It's a funny one, and I want to drag your audience down too much of an academic rabbit hole, because I'll put everybody to sleep. But there's very different approaches to kind of how we conduct research in my own field, international relations, and in the social sciences more generally. Some folks, particularly in the US, follow a kind of hypothesis testing model, where there's like, here's what I expect to see, here are the kind of analytical tools and questions I'm going to use to kind of verify, falsify that. I came at it from a slightly more kind of European kind of post-positivist, as we call it, approach, which was much more about, like, I wanted to keep the research questions quite open and actually have that guide the research and the conclusion. So I had a sense of the sort of themes that I found fascinating. So as I said, stuff around immersion, also stuff around the drive to win. Like, is this like a perpetual motion machine that keeps us playing? Like, how does that work? So I had initially 10 interview questions that started from the quite kind of general, and then went through some of these sort of more specific thematics, which ended up then coming to become the chapters of the book. What I always want to do at the beginning of an interview, though, is kind of put the interview at their ease, because I think in my own experience of being interviewed, there's always that sense of like, A, does the researcher have a kind of agenda here? But also, like, why do they think I'm interesting? And a lot of folks took some persuading to be like, no, it really just is like your practice that I'm interested in. Like, you don't have to resolve, the kind of perennial questions of professional wargaming for me. I just kind of want to know what it is that you're doing in your own institution, in your own practice. And so I think once you signal to people that it's simply that, then people just, I think, feel qualified and feel comfortable speaking. And that's where the richness of the project comes from. So I had this idea of what I call play as pedagogy. So I was really interested to think about how people who use games, particularly for education and for training, how they think it works, how they think it engages players. And so I tried to structure a couple of the research questions around that. How do they generate buy-in? To what extent is that successful in their estimation? And people in different institutions with different backgrounds had quite wide-ranging assessments of that. Some people say, I think almost everybody I interviewed was a wargaming enthusiast and professional, but they did actually have quite different evaluations of its merits, of its success. Yeah. And so I wanted to capture something of that. One thing I heard time and again, of course, I think first of all from Yuna Wong and then from many others, was that we still don't actually have like established, reliable criteria by means of which to figure out and to prove, that this is efficacious. So I think some folks were hoping I would do that in the course of the project. It wasn't kind of geared around that research question, although I am actually currently working on another project which thinks about wargaming as a research method and how to make that more rigorous, but also how to maybe distance some of the more modern Sims criteria of rigor to actually give wargamers a bit more breathing space to evaluate its efficacy, its utility in their own terms. So hopefully I'll do something useful with that project, if not the first.
It's interesting you bring up Yuna and others mentioning, hey, how, if at all, are you going to be able to prove the effectiveness of wargaming as a part of this? You mentioned at the start of all that, kind of the difference between American social science research and literally everyone else in the world. Americans aren't happy if they can't measure something. And in my social science background is very definitely a quantoid social science background, right? Mm-hmm. Let's operationalize the variables. Let's figure out how we can measure them. Let's figure out what those identifying characteristics are. Let's survey it. Let's observe it. Let's whatever. I've done a lot with survey research in my life just because that's been some of the background, but that's also been the kind of research that I've generally preferred doing. One of the guys who was on my PhD committee was the former head of the Center for Survey Research. So I mean, that's just stuff that I'm used to, and that doesn't mean that qualitative research is unfamiliar. That's just not what I've done, and in part that was shaped by who my faculty members were. But the idea that somebody's saying, hey, how can we statistically prove that this is useful and effective is such a classic American sort of thing to say, hey, look, boss, here are the numbers that say this is good. And please let us do more of it. It's such an American approach to things.
It's a funny one. I mean, my own field, international relations, but as you say, across the social sciences, this has been a debate that's gone on, decades, further, coming on a century and beyond. I was speaking a couple of years back with Ellie Bartels. If people haven't read her PhD dissertation done over at Rand Party a couple of years ago, she does a really amazing job looking at the different kind of methodological underpinnings of wargaming. I won't, again, go too far into all the kind of academic abstraction there, but I think she's really blazed a trail. My colleague, David Banks at King's, has also written on the methodological machineries of wargaming. So there are kind of research projects now coming out trying to tackle some of this stuff. Like how do you verify? How do you make it rigorous? How do you show your superior, your funder, your stakeholder that there is value added here? And I think one of my own position on this is that I think wargaming, like the value added of wargaming can't always be apprehended numerically, right? This is a subjective enterprise. It's about people, it's about experience, it's about decision making. It's quite hard to capture that in purely kind of quantitative terms. And so there's a tricky situation, I think, that professional wargamers have where they're obliged to justify something in terms of criteria that actually are not entirely applicable to the art or science or craft of wargaming, depending how you define it there. Yeah. So I'm hoping in this next project to maybe add something there, some other terms of verification, of justification. So really that's going to involve going back to what do we mean by science? How do we justify our research? And maybe stepping a little bit away where possible from that sense that only numbers and quants count. Yeah. Because I think one thing that really spoke to me, and I think everything I read about wargaming makes this point, is that it's about human decision-making. And that is something which is both quantifiable, but also inherently qualitative. And so how we study that, I think is really crucial.
Yeah, and human decision-making is very hard to boil down to a drop-down list of options. Right. I mean, that's your big difference between, the old text-based computer role-playing games versus sitting around a table with a dungeon master and playing a TTR, regular tabletop role-playing game that, the limitless imagination that human decision-making can bring to something is not something easily quantifiable.
Right.
One of the ways that I got around that some when I was working towards my PhD, I never finished the dissertation. I ran out of money is really what it came down to. And but one of the things that I was heavily focused on as a part of that was not so much any objective measurement of decision making or learning uptake or any of that. Although we did, it was looking at the differences between interactive and non-interactive learning conditions for the users. And it was a PhD in communication, but it was the interactivity piece was the main part that I was interested in. And while you can do just blatant measurements of, hey, we're gonna do the slide-o-matic versus playing the game where you've got stuff that you're being introduced to throughout the game, and then we're gonna test you on everything after the fact and see how you score on the test. That's basic stuff. But where I went a little deeper and what I was interested in was the measures of self-efficacy. And so to the non-academic crowd out there, That is the degree to which you as the participant feel that you are more or less effective with what you've learned. So it is inherently a measure of what you think about yourself, not an objective measure of did you do better or worse on the test. You can do worse on the test, but feel better about what you learned. And those two things are both compatible. It sounds weird, but those are compatible, that you feel better about what you learned. And so that was one of the ways in which I was interested more in not just, hey, did you do okay, but did the changing the level of interactivity, how did that make you feel about what you had learned, and whether or not what you learned was more or less effective.
Right.
So that was a way around. Now, that's a challenge there, is that's very individual focused. It is really, really hard to get at that self-efficacy measure for groups and for teams, for more than one person at a time. And so if you're talking about self-efficacy of a group, that's really hard to measure.
Sure.
Because it's not just the aggregate of the individual people. It's, you've got to account for the group dynamics. But that was a way that I got around just the purely objective, quantifiable measures of, hey, we did better on this than this based on these three objective criteria. Now, what do you think about what
Season 16 of Mentioned in Dispatches is underway, and we couldn't do it without our Patreon supporters, and especially the regimental captains at the top level. The Armchair Dragoons would like to thank Chris Anthony, James M., Brian Silcott, Chet Bell, Joseph Knorr, Paul LaFontaine, Miles R., Staggerwing, Fred's Dog, and Fred 2, Kevin Bertram, Michael Sunborg, Patrick Garrity, Catastrophe Games, Hethwell Wargames, and Greg from Pico Armor. They help us to keep our objectives in our line of sight. You too can support the Regiment of Strategy Gaming as a Patreon supporter at patreon.com/armchairdragoons.
It makes perfect sense to me. And I think, when we think about the value of war games, as we know, war games are not predictive. They're not designed to be, directly translated into the real world. They are actually about the people who play them. And to that extent, why would we want to turn something which is about subjective experience into something objective? That's, to my mind, not the purpose of a game. We have almost this hierarchy that like objective good, subjective bad. But if the point is you're trying to teach people, then it is inherently a subjective experience. Similarly, if you're trying to train, similarly, if you're trying to recruit, if you're using games for, processing trauma or getting used to a prosthetic limb, whatever it is, all of these things are about an individual, a subject, or as you say, a group. So I think we should just stop being so worried about being kind of non-objective in the sense that it's an inherently subjective enterprise, and that's precisely its value. I think that's, and the other kind of point I would make there is that, and I know we're heading now in the kind of, some people say the sine wave is shifting around and we have mods and sims and things, particularly with the advent of AI coming in. But I think, we need to be really cautious there because, again, it's the value added, wargaming's value added is its focus on the human. If you start automating that, if you start taking players out or kind of, sort of sending off your decision-making to an automated agent, then you really fundamentally undermine the value of wargaming, because the value oftentimes of wargaming is not the ultimate consequence or output of the game. Sometimes it is, but if it's teaching or training, then it's about the process. And so you take away the pressure of decision-making, you take away the player's pedagogy, as I frame it in the book, which is precisely the value added. So I think, to the degree it's possible, pushing back against this process of automation is going to be to the wargaming community's benefit, because I think it does risk collapsing something of wargaming into mods and sims, with which it's not necessarily kind of at odds, but certainly they're not one and the same.
Yeah. It's the thinking part being really, I 100% agree with you that's really the paramount thing that you're looking at. And the analogy that I've heard that was really good was, look, I can use a forklift to move the weights across the gym. Right. That's not the point. The point isn't that the weights need to be moved. The point is that I need to be lifting and moving the weights because it is my exertion that creates the benefit for me. It is not that the weights need to be moved from one side of the building to the other. Yeah, I go get a forklift to do that. That doesn't help me, and
Absolutely right. And we're seeing this at in the university sector and all over the place, where students are kind of outsourcing their thinking, as you say, and turning in papers, and you're like, well, I can see that this in some ways, if you have students coming in at an early point and they're not, you don't expect students to be coming in and getting first class results right away.
Yeah.
And it's not that AI is necessarily getting them first class results, but what it is it's meaning they may be getting results better at the beginning than they would without the AI, but it means that they never go on that learning curve at all. And so take the AI away and they're exactly where they started at the start of their degree. They basically just thrown their tuition right down the bathroom flush. So
yeah, should I ever end up back in a classroom again, I envision quite a number of exams or whatever effectiveness measures being done handwritten on plain paper, right? Everybody put everything away, clear your desk. Here's a sheet of paper, write for me.
Yeah, and we are having a turn to that at the moment.
Let's see who can do it. Yeah. As you were going through the book and what developed out of the interviews and the observations and the folks you were able to talk to, what were some of the results that you got that kind of surprised you or sort of made you really rethink what you went into the interview or the session as you were going through those interviews or coming out the other end going, wow, wait, that wasn't what I was expecting at all?
One of the side kind of projects that I ended up writing a bunch of different papers as well as the book. And sometimes you get that thing where an academic, writes a book and then they publish a bunch of the chapters separately and it all gets a bit repetitive. I tried not to do that. There was one chapter of the book that did appear earlier, but that was the extent of it. And a side kind of project came out of it when I was speaking to some vets. This was another area that ex-military folk featured more outside of the project of the book than inside in some regards. And I started getting these extremely kind of emotional stories come out. And I had one guy say to me, a guy called Steve Machuga, who runs an amazing veterans kind of grassroots gaming group called stackup.org. And he was saying to me simply that gaming saved his life. And I was really struck by that. I ended up writing a paper which is called Video Games Saved My Life. And what these folks do essentially is send off care packages to serving personnel with gaming gear, oftentimes kind of digital games, sometimes analog games as well. But they also have kind of a whole bunch of chapters across the contiguous US and now also elsewhere in the world, where it's about community building, where it's about online activities, whether it's about kind of particularly mental health and suicide prevention. And this whole other project came out around games as a tool of recovery, which I was not expecting. I was very much talking to people about what you do in the classroom, what you do in professional military education, what you do in training environment. Yeah. And it was this other side of the coin story that really hit home very powerfully. I was speaking with people who were, were quadriplegic, people who had lost, limbs to IEDs. I spoke to one person who learned to play games with their feet, having had both of their arms lost to an IED. And what was fascinating too was, you have all of the sort of pearl clutching stuff around, violent video games destroying society and everything. What was really fascinating to me in this series of interviews was that, these weren't folks who had sort of renounced their service. They hadn't become anti-militarists or anything. And they were still playing the very same games that oftentimes had been used for recruitment and still playing first-person shooters and still playing highly militarized games, but using them in this whole different way for recovery and community building. So one anecdote was that somebody was at a gaming, so these guys go on the road and go to various gaming conventions. I caught up with them at PAX East a few years ago on one of my research trips. And people were saying things like, oh yeah, I know, I was chatting to this guy who, we were in game together. And there was some sort of knife fight or something. And the guy says, oh, that isn't how that would go. And then, then 2 hours later, there they still are talking about this guy's experience, how he's having mental health difficulties and so on. So I was absolutely astonished. And again, astonished by the openness of people who were happy to talk to me about these very personal experiences where gaming had literally, in some cases, saved their lives. Yeah,
there's the idea of gaming as a therapeutic tool, I think, is really interesting. It's also very, very new. I mean,
right.
The idea of studying games at all is relatively new compared to the rest of academia, but especially in those kinds of therapeutic uses. There's a board game that was published by Hollandspiel called Heading Forward that is about some mental health recovery. And we actually we're trying to lock down the scheduling. I'm really hoping that the schedule works out, but we had a Georgetown student who we're trying to get a session scheduled for Connections Online, which as folks are hearing this podcast is just a couple of days away, but we are trying to get Maggie scheduled. If we can make the schedule work, we'll have her there. But it's about the uses of gaming for some mental health purposes. And I don't think it's so much about like diagnoses as it is about, sort of coping and recovery kinds of things.
Right.
I don't want to speak for her. I'm going to let her presentation, assuming we can make it work, that we'll let that go. But those kinds of cases are so rare that you can count them on two hands and have fingers left over, to my knowledge. I think it's really neat, but nobody's doing it.
Mm-hmm. It was fascinating. It was an example of a digital game that I think came out of the University of Southern California, if I'm not mistaken, a number of years ago. And I think it took the tactical Iraqi kind of platform and they did something around, I may be misremembering some of the details here, so apologies for that. It's a while since I looked into it. But there was certainly a game that was used essentially for what they were calling a sort of exposure therapy. So to go back to traumatic experience and to help and assist a service person or a veteran kind of work through that. Yeah. It's a fascinating. I'm no mental health professional. I'm no psychologist, but I gather that there are sort of different opinions here about how that could work and whether that would be, because we talk about gaming being safe to fail, right? I mean, that's not so safe to fail when someone's mental health is at stake. A totally fascinating topic, one I would really like to look further into.
Obviously, you focused a lot of this on the American audience, on the not the American audience, but American participants, on the U.S. DoD, the contractors that support it, the soldiers that were deployed on behalf of it. Were there many interviews or discussions that you had with non-Americans or Americans that were working for non-U.S. organizations?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was lucky enough to go to one of the Viking exercises out in Sweden, and that was a super international community. Had folks both in the room and joining on remote faculties from a whole range of countries. It's been very interesting. I don't know how kind of political we want to get in terms of the kind of changes around DoD and DOW at the moment in the States. But it's certainly interesting to see where some consensuses are starting to diverge, right? So at the time, I was hearing quite a lot of the same stuff from the US, from European folks. I went out to Australia and was doing some interviews and some talks out at UNSW out there. And really, people were singing from the same hymn sheet. I think the change of US administration has changed that somewhat. I'm also working at the moment on a project looking at kind of human security gaming. And even a couple of years back when we were putting this together, myself and a brilliant colleague, Paul Kirby, who's at Queen Mary, University of London, we were saying things like, human security is occupying a greater place in, gaming, X's, Sims, all the rest of it. With a focus on things like, women and, civilians and refugees and so on. And of course, we do have now a bit of a sea change in the States around those topics. Yeah. So that has necessitated us kind of pivoting off to Europe, to Australasia, to other places, which I think is no bad thing. It's interesting. The United States has oftentimes been seen as the sort of center of Western wargaming, but there's a lot to be learned from gaming happening in all parts of Europe, elsewhere in the Americas, in Asia as well, of course, and beyond.
Yeah, that is something that has been noted a lot in the U.S. wargaming community, and I am part of the nominating committee for the Charles S. Roberts Awards each year. I think this is my 4th or 5th year on the committee now. That one of the things that consistently comes up in the committee discussions themselves, but also even after the fact, even though we still talk about it in the committee, it still becomes an issue after the fact that, it'd be nice if you had more international people nominated for these things. We're like, that's great. We don't know who they are.
Right.
It's so the fact that there is more of that and we are becoming more aware of that, I think is a great thing. I think having those different ideas and mindsets and perspectives, I think only helps broaden the potential pool of cool things that we can do with wargaming.
There's lots of debate at the minute about what difference does it make to have a diverse kind of player group, right? Does it actually, and this is something where more research needs to be done. People make a lot of assumptions around, if you add this kind of person or that kind of person, it's going to lead to, these kinds of outcomes. The typical one is around, women, they're going to be more peaceable, they're going to be more cooperative. I don't know, women wargamers can be pretty much just as intense as their male counterparts.
I coached women's soccer for a couple of years. They can be mean.
Right. Yeah, no, don't I think underestimate at your peril for sure. So I think I'd always want to push back against any kind of inadvertent stereotyping here. I don't think it's important to add women, for instance, because it's going to make gaming more peaceful. I think it's important to have as diverse a group, a range of people as possible, because then you get more diverse patterns of thinking in all kinds of directions, not necessarily in one stereotypical direction.
Yeah, and I'm sure that there's going to be somebody out there commenting or listening to this podcast or hearing just that little excerpt somewhere and go, damn, we don't need quotas at the local game store. Nobody's talking about the local game store, right? We're talking about a professional gaming context here. You playing hobby games, play with whoever the hell you want. Like, I don't care. Like, I think it's cool when we bring more people to the table of all kinds, because it's more wargamers. But in this case, we're talking about a very specific, particular professional context where the outcomes do, in fact, really matter beyond just who's on the hook for the beer tab at the end of the night. Right. So,
right. And that is an important question. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah. I got one more question for you about the research you've done, and then I want to pivot a little bit to some of the stuff you're working on now and what's coming up next. But in your research, I don't know that you intentionally looked for this, but did you get much of a sense of differences in attitudes towards or outcomes from or participation in the different kinds of wargaming when it was differentiated by manual tabletop wargaming versus something computer mediated or digital? Did the presence of a power cord make a difference in any of the wargaming pieces that you were observing or in any of the interviews that you did? Did people notice differences?
Absolutely. I remember the first time we spoke, Brant, you highlighted this point to me, and it really stuck with me, that exact phrase, the power cord. I was like, that's a great thing to bear in mind in terms of what people hear when they hear the word wargaming. And I think I assumed coming into this that digital would be king, right? But actually what I found was that partly because of accessibility, partly because of a whole host of reasons, tabletop analog gaming seems to be alive and well. And there are really good reasons, I think, that people want to stick with that. Just to mention a couple of them, I think the piece about immersion, which I was always fascinated by, it was really interesting to talk to people about, are there different kinds of immersion that come out of analog versus digital gaming? And it wasn't really a question that I'd asked myself, but it started coming up in the interviews. And I was like, oh, here's a really interesting data point that I think I need to look into. Because you would assume that with more bells and whistles and, all the rest of it, that would create deeper and longer lasting immersion. But actually, the imaginative leap that it takes when you're using cards, counters, dice, more analog artifacts, seemed, at least according to a good number of research participants, to actually improve immersion, or at least generate a different kind of immersion that is more kind of cerebral. It also, and one of the points I was really interested in to push in the book as well, was about kind of the experience of the player agency. So I think we should move away from the idea that players are just the sort of targets of gaming. I think we should think about, like, what is their agency in this? Lots of debates about that in, recreational games and so on. And so I was really keen to ask, are there kind of more agential play experiences that different kinds of games can allow? And I think that the impression I got from research participants was, the greater the extent to which a game is apprehended in a black box, a digital game where you have to be a coder to challenge anything, and where the rule set is literally off the table, in a sense, the less agency you have, because you're just slotted into your role and you follow the game's dynamics and mechanics and incentives. Whereas a tabletop game, a game that is more negotiated, where the rules are set out, is also subject to greater contestation. And that means that players have a much greater level of agency to say, here's what does make sense, here's what doesn't make sense. What I call for in the book probably goes beyond what your average kind of professional wargamer might want. But I actually think, players should be encouraged to really push at the limits of games, to, if not break the game, at least to kind of play the game playfully, and to actually think about rule sets, assumptions, because games are always political artifacts. They're full of assumptions, they're full of ideas and kind of givens that the designer builds into them, sometimes deliberately because it's what the sponsor or the stakeholder wants, or sometimes because it's just their own assumptions going in. But I think if you're really going to learn something from games, it's not only about playing them in the way that they're intended. It's around thinking of them as texts or artifacts to be, really pulled and pushed around a bit, and to see, what are the assumptions and what are the incentives, and what am I pushed towards doing? What am I rewarded for doing? What am I punished for doing? And all of that stuff. So I think there is a greater degree of the capacity for playful agential play in manual oftentimes than is the case with digital.
Yeah, but you mentioned the model. I'm going to borrow a James Sterrettism here, but one of the things that he's always pointed out is that with your manual game, with the paper game on the table in front of you, if you want to make a change, you need a Sharpie.
Right.
If you're trying to make a change to a digital game, you need access to the source code, and that may not be readily available.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, if there's a problem with the tabletop game you're doing, I can fix that with a piece of tape or with a ballpoint pen or with marker or whatever. That is easily fixable. Whereas that may not be the case on a digital game. So.
Right. And this has a democratizing effect, right? It means that designers can get away with less, and it means that players have, greater opportunity there to, as you say, amend, push back, cross stuff out if need be.
Setting the book aside for a minute, not that we're trying to kick it to the curb or anything, but you've been doing other stuff since then. What's currently on the table, and what's next in your continued explorations and research here?
I mean, it's so funny because I finished my initial book, my first project before the gaming project, and I was like, that is it. I'm done. I am done with the neocons. I got nothing else to say. And with the gaming stuff, even though I've been working on this now for the best part of a decade, I still feel like I'm right at the beginning. That's partly because of the pace of change and because of, technological leaps and everybody scrambling to try to keep up with them. But I also think it's limitlessly fascinating. I really do. And I think it's also, it remains super topical, like, especially as an academic. I do feel really privileged that, I go to someone's house for dinner and they ask what I do. And, when you start talking about games, people are like, oh, cool. What a fascinating research topic. And so I really feel like there's so much more to be done in this field. So as I mentioned, one project I'm looking at is surrounding human security gaming. So my research partner, Paul Kirby, and I are asking the question of kind of, can we go beyond the war in wargaming? Yeah. And to what degree can and should human security factors be modeled in? So we've done a bunch of interviews on that. It's been a very interesting time to do interviews. It's been more difficult this time around to do interviews because of political changes that are making people less, I guess, comfortable to speak. But also, I think those folks who've been working on human security have been oftentimes moved on to other enterprises because of the current climate. So that's, again, made us pivot elsewhere. So we've been talking to a lot of international organizations, Red Cross and other kind of agencies that do a lot of gaming exercises and sims that factor in human security questions.
For our hobby audience, the folks that are not familiar with the professional space, when you're talking about human security, what's an example of the kind of thing that you might see in that you wouldn't see in what the hobbyists would be thinking of as a war game?
That's a great point. Yeah, I maybe jumped ahead a little bit there, or jumped sideways a little bit there. So what most of the time, and I don't want to overgeneralize, but most folks, when they think about war games, as I understand it, it's a kinetic enterprise, right? It's a force on force thing. So you have, adversarial encounters, and essentially it's about, in one way or another, the pursuit of victory conditions. So factoring human security in would be more around kind of who are I guess the collateral damage, right? Like if you were thinking about war games that are not just about, the kinetic forces, but around, say, and you see a lot of this. This is one of the kind of starting points of the project. Oftentimes when we talk about wargaming, it actually isn't just about war, right? Like, crisis simulation is much, much broader than that. So, it could be a, pandemic game. It could be, something around a crisis response, natural disasters, these sorts of things. So it's about games which factor in things like protection of civilians, or, moving, a displaced population from one place to another, the experience of refugees or a certain group, an ethnic minority, or something like that. And there is a lot of this going on. There's also, of course, a lot of so-called peace gaming on the rise now as well. So we're looking a little bit into that. We've got King's Wargaming Week coming up in May, and we're going to be having a kind of focus on human security as part of that, and also a kind of sub-workshop looking precisely at peace gaming as a kind of something that is linked to, different from, but in some ways I think complementary to wargaming as we more conventionally understand it.
So for the hobbyists, something that might have crossed their radar along the way that probably falls squarely in this camp was the game that PAX Sims / Rex's team up at McGill put out, Aftershock, about a decade ago now.
Right.
And so that was the wargaming the response to an earthquake in Caribbean island. It was loosely based on the Haiti earthquake. As the hobbyists like to describe things, it was Haiti with the serial numbers filed off. We use that term a lot, right? It's this, but with the serial numbers filed off. So it was clearly inspired by, and in the case of Aftershock, I happen to know it was directly inspired by the Haiti earthquake, because I was part of the game lab at Connections that year that helped put together some initial drafts of it. And a lot of the current model that you see in the Aftershock game was developed by Rex and Gary Melanti, who at the time was working with the World Bank. I'm not sure where Gary is these days, but it was in a hotel bar. We were sitting there munching on appetizers and drinking beer, and they sort of brainstormed the bulk of what's currently the model in Aftershock while I just sat there and made sarcastic remarks. I really had very, very little to do with what came out of that. It was Rex and Gary is the core mechanics that you see in the game there. I just happened to be sitting there while they were doing it. But that's one that I think the hobbyists might know about, or at least have seen some awareness of, in part because it's been around for 10 years, but in part because a bunch of the hobby media out there has talked about it, including the Dragoons. We've got a review of it in our archives, and so that's one folks might see. You mentioned civilian populations. A number of years ago, I had done a presentation on civilians in wargaming, but from a hobbyist perspective, so not the professional perspective. Obviously, in the professional perspective, this is important. You will see when the Tradoc folks, Tradoc G2, did the Mad Scientist workshop on wargaming up at Georgetown back in 24. It was the day after the election is what it was, because my wife was concerned with me going up to DC the day after the election. I'm like, look, I'm going to be fine. I'm going to a college campus. It'll be okay. We'll be, it's no big deal. They had a whole panel on civilian harm reduction, and that is something that matters. In the hobby space, though, I think it gets kind of hard to do, because one of the things you have to consider in all of this, and I'd be curious sort of how you've seen some people tackle this from a professional perspective. I'm stumbling over my own words here, and I haven't even had a beer yet today. If you are going to include civilians in the war game, like, why are they there? Are they just taking up space? Are they just like clogging roads? Well, you might could do that, just adjusting your movement factors. If there's a specific mission of sort of protect the civilians or escort the civilians from point A to point B, or somehow take care of these civilians on the part of one player, then on the part of the other player, you have to build in a mechanic to somehow harm the civilians. Otherwise, there's no need to protect them, right? Otherwise, they're just moving around the board. Who cares? Well, as soon as you start building in a mechanic by which one player is intentionally shooting civilians in order to force the other one to protect them, congrats, you just built a war crimes game. And maybe that's a little challenging in the hobby space that, you might not want to actually go there. When you start with, hey, there's a mission to escort these civilians, this is something that is normal in war, much less in war gaming as a preparation for that. Like, you expect that kind of stuff. In a hobby game, maybe not so much. So, where do you see that sort of thing come in the professional space? And do the attitudes get to, oh my God, we just built a war crime simulator? Like, how do people approach that?
It's a tricky one, right? I mean, I think I suppose the different sorts of games we could think of. If it's around protection of civilians in a sort of force-on-force environment, or is it protection of civilians in something like a pandemic environment or something like that? Like, one thing I think you can do is like outsource the civilian harm to like a non-player phenomenon, so that you get around that. So as you say, you're not having somebody play as the
years ago we had a Connections online session of what happens when Mother Nature is the red team. I mean,
it's a great thematic. Yeah, absolutely. And these things, as COVID taught us, one can't prepare too much. If this had been wargaming more thoroughly, here in the UK, the response was pretty appalling. One can't help but think, why were war games not conducted around this potential that scientists have been telling us for some time, could well be a thing, was likely to become a thing at some stage.
But the red team isn't always Mother Nature. And like Srebrenica existed, it did happen. We have real world studies to point to say, hey, maybe we want to incorporate in a war game, how do we prevent this? And is that something that you've gotten that deep in the weeds to yet? Or is that something that you're not there yet? Or is that something that like people aren't doing because it's just sort of challenging and dangerous?
I'm just trying to think back to various examples. I mean, I think in some training games and in some education games, like, somebody has to take that on. And oftentimes that is outsourced to pretty high-ranking folk or to folk outside the military establishment who were there almost as like subject matter experts who know a lot about whatever the bar tag removed state is supposed to be. Yeah. And they're asked precisely to, sometimes they're asked precisely to go down paths that would be ethically questionable so as to be useful in the teaching or training environment. Sometimes, as we know, people go off piste and do it anyhow. There's the Millennium Challenge example that people refer to oftentimes where, and this is where we get into, the weeds of how war games can be used without even meaning to sometimes, to kind of prop up existing assumptions and to want to take off the table certain kinds of tactics, certain kinds of kinetic encounters, which then turn out, potentially to have grounds in reality. Yeah. So I think it's an ethically dubious or ethically complex thing. Is it better to have folks come in and play problematic roles so as to be better prepared in the future? Or do we take those ethically ambiguous things off the table and leave ourselves more exposed to challenges when they do arise, if they arise?
Yeah, it is absolutely a hard question to wrestle with, and I don't envy anyone who is doing so. Again, I was approaching it purely from a hobbyist perspective. People want to talk about, fidelity to reality in their war games and how do we make something realistic. And one of the things that is frequently ignored here in the U.S., like you've got your red overlay, your blue overlay, and you've got your green overlay, right? The civilians, the locals, the non-combatants, and what happens with the green common operating picture out there. And that's something that is abstracted out of a lot of hobby war games, but is really, really damn important to the professionals. And so where the hobbyists are certainly disincentivized to tackle those things for 1,000 understandable reasons, I wonder if the professionals aren't doing themselves a disservice if they ignore or avoid them. And so when you talk about human security, like that's something that just jumps right to the top of my mind because I've seen those discussions from the hobby space come up,
Right.
So it's very easy to have the mythical boogeyman, right? The divine acts of vengeance that pop in that you have no way to do anything about. You just have to react to them. But the ones that you could prevent you're not shooting back at the hurricane, but you can shoot back at the guys trying to shoot your civilians. Beyond the human security piece, are there other things out there on your plate, or is that pretty much filling it up for you?
Oh no, the plate. I was going to use an eating analogy there. I keep eating but there seems to be so much mileage here. So of course it's almost impossible to think about gaming at the moment abstracted from the whole kind of AI explosion. So I've been invited to just finished a chapter for a new book on the future of war, organized by a great colleague at the University of Lancaster, Mark Lacey. And so I've written a chapter looking at the kind of military race for AI-enabled wargaming, thinking about kind of superhuman decision-making or the desire for decision-making at machine speed, and going back to this question of prediction. In some of the debates at the moment, people seem to be suggesting or claiming in some cases that AI can get us to this sort of holy grail of prediction that professional gamers have long said is not a thing, right? And yet under the radar, even like Thomas Allen's book from the 1980s, he's talking about how this sort of predictive capacity is kind of encouraged by superiors, and that there is this undertone of like, we know you can't do it, but like, could you just like do it? And so it seems a really fascinating time to think about what does it mean to accelerate decision-making beyond, human pace, but also it's not just about speed, right? It's also about outsourcing and about what that means for questions of ethics, questions of who is taking decisions if machines are taking them at speeds that humans can't even keep up with, much less, process all the data in advance. Yeah, I'm really fascinated by this question of, is AI going to turn wargaming into something closer to modern Sims? And really, I think a lot in the community want to push back against that. At the same moment, some in the community seem to be like super keen to integrate this tech. So my next project is to start speaking to people about that. I've written this book chapter, which was just done on sort of existing reports on literature, but now I need to get back out of my office, back out into the field, and start figuring out like, why are the enthusiasts enthusiastic? Why are the skeptics so very skeptic?
Yeah. To me, I think one of the things involved in this is, you mentioned the speed of the decision-making, but also some of the outsourcing of the decision-making. To me, one of the things that it comes back to is what we were just talking about a minute ago with the difference between digital versus manual games. The model's a black box for the AI. Like, right. I have no idea how it arrived at that decision. Right. And so how do I know what was actually considered as meaningful factors in that? You can say, well, what did you tell it? What was the prompt that you wrote? And that's fine. But if I don't know the underlying data on which that large language model was trained, it doesn't matter what prompt I write.
Right.
There's still baked in assumptions on the presence or absence of the data that was used to train that model.
Absolutely. And the key thing about one of the, so I've been going through all the reports from the kind of big think tanks and research institutes. There's been a whole, as you imagine, a whole kind of wealth of stuff written on this recently. But one of the fundamental points that some of the wargaming folks who seem to be very into this, as I think you're implying, sort of haven't sort of centered fully, is that if you're going to do AI in gaming, you have to digitize first. So you're basically taking analog gaming off the table. And for all the reasons we were speaking about earlier, analog has a whole bunch of advantages around democratizing wargaming, around accountability, around sort of leveling the playing field between designer and player, but also revisability, right? And as you say, I think, that first step of moving everything to digitization, but then not just digitization, it has, like, we know very well what LLMs are good for and what they're not good for. And to turn more games into something that has a stable sort of series of data sets and sort of trajectories, again, move it away from what wargaming is, which is dynamic, which is evolving, which is not subject to stable, replicable, anticipatable maneuvers and decision moves.
Yeah. Look, my day job, I'm an IT project manager. Right? And I've been doing this for 20 years around all of the other wargaming stuff that I do. I pay the bills as an IT project manager. And so as soon as anybody wants to start talking about technology stuff, I am instantly skeptical, if only because of the support requirements necessary to execute some larger computer-driven exercise. Nobody has ever needed to upgrade the software on their table, ever, right? There has never been a connectivity issue with the chair. They might have a broken leg, swap it out, tape it back together, whatever, like that is an easy fix. I don't need to make sure that, I've got the latest, upgrade of the count, to put the counters on the map. If there's a problem, I get out a Sharpie. And I'm not worried about, am I allowed to run this on the network or not, because of very real information security issues out there. I'm not trying to bring third-party software into, inside the wire, inside a secured facility or environment. I'm bringing in a notebook full of paper, right? There's very little IT risk from a notebook full of paper and a bunch of cardboard. And so, when you look at all of the things that can break in the IT world, which I got 20 years of watching happen, I just look at all that and I go, hey, that's great, guys. But you know what? If I drop a monitor on the ground, I've got a broken monitor. If I drop a boxed war game on the ground, I've got a mess, but I can pick it all back up, right? Unless somebody spills a soft drink on it. You spill a soft drink on a computer, it's screwed too. So that condition applies equally. But I just look at, it's not to say that the technical tools don't work and can't be good and can't be useful, but man, this headlong rush to plug everything into a wall just drives me nuts.
And that's before, and that's as far as the case with digital, but then you add AI into that too.
Yeah.
This is not just about the hardware of digital, it's about self-altering software and how one keeps a lid on that. I couldn't begin to fathom.
I guess what all this means is in like 2 years, we're going to have you back to talk about what you found out.
I would love that. That would be really fantastic. It's an absolute pleasure to be asked, and I'd love to again.
I think that's where all that ends up. We're a little over an hour as we're recording this. Again, once we edit out me saying, it's going to get a little shorter here, but it's, it is late where you are, and I appreciate you setting aside the time. I don't want to tax your time or the audience's attention span here, but I do want to thank you very much for joining us for this. Again, it's for the hobbyists. This is an interesting book, but it is a very particular book looking at the professional space and written in an academic voice. And so there are some of you that are going to look at that and go, oh my God, there's no way I'm going to get it. I get it. Like I 100% get it. But I think for those of you that are interested in that space and you take the time to adjust to what you're reading, you're going to find a fascinating book full of, as Aggie noted, full of the first person voice of a lot of the people in this community. And there's a lot of smart folks that talk to her. And then somehow I ended up in there too. I don't know.
It was, as I've tried to persuade you before, your inputs were extremely helpful. So I thank you for that as well as for this. And I do say in the book as well, like, not every chapter is necessarily for everybody. Like there are some sort of philosophical musings that I find kind of interesting. But, certainly there are the more applied chapters where it's about like what is happening in the professional space in terms of these teaching and learning mechanisms in particular. And I hope that is of interest to some folks. Fingers crossed.
Yeah. And so the link to the book is on this podcast episode. You can go hit the link and go find it there. I think you can largely pick it up at just about any of the major online retailers or direct from the publisher. So there are places you can get it. That's not a problem. I don't think there's an audiobook version that you can just put on and hop on the treadmill, but I think it would be really weird to do with all
that. Would be a stranger. I would maybe caution against that unless you happen to be into like weird French philosophy, which
that would be an even more difficult one there. So Aggie, thank you very much for the time. I really do appreciate it. And this has been a fascinating conversation. We'd probably go for hours if it weren't for the time difference.
I appreciate that. Well, thanks for having me. Thanks to everyone listening, and wishing you all the best.
Awesome. All right, audience, we've got one more episode, as we had mentioned. Again, if you do get a chance, please go hit one of your, whatever podcast service you're listening to us on, and just go throw us a rating. Like, we prefer 5 stars, but be honest about whatever it is that you're rating us, and throw a comment in there, because that helps with discoverability. That helps other people find the podcast when we have enough ratings that the podcast engines go, oh, hey, people are paying attention to this. We should let more people know about it. That helps us out. Share it on your social channels, whatever. We definitely appreciate that. As you are listening to this when it is first released, Connections Online is just a couple of days away. So if this sort of professional wargaming space is of interest to you, take a look at Connections Online. It is a virtual event that the Dragoons co-sponsor. It is not a game-playing event. This is seminars and panels and discussions and presentations all around the professional wargaming space, but I think there's a lot of interesting things that folks can take away from it. We have a handful of Dragoon hobbyists that are regulars at Connections Online because they just enjoy what they can learn from the professional space. So if you get a chance to pop in there, take a look at it. If not, a couple of weeks later, we'll release all the videos to the public. You'll be able to watch them for free. What you won't get is the interaction that you would have had with either the panelists or your fellow conference attendees. Get the right word there. Aggie, thank you very much. We'll call it a night so that you can get to bed because, again, you're a couple hours ahead of us. And I got a hockey game to go watch tonight, so that'll be fun.
Enjoy that. Have a great evening. Thank you so much.
Folks, thank you very much for being here. We'll catch you next time on another episode of Mentioning Dispatches.